While the full-blown war in Ukraine did not start until 2022, the conflict has been brewing in the country since as far back as 2014, when protests in the capital city of Kiev led to the ousting of Ukraine's pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych. Following Yanukovych's removal, Russian forces annexed Crimea, a peninsula in southern Ukraine, and Russian-backed separatists began fighting Ukrainian forces in the eastern part of the country. Now, considering that the United States has a reputation for getting involved in countries' disputes, it's easy to think that it has gotten itself involved in this as well.
The $3 billion in direct aid to Ukraine includes 50 Bradley fighting vehicles. It's the first time the armored carrier will be sent to Ukraine. The package also includes nearly 300 other armored vehicles, as well as air defense systems and anti-tank rockets.
However, the answer to the question of whether America is funding the Ukraine war depends on the context. If the question is whether they are backing Russia, who is the instigator of the war, the answer is no. At least, nothing that the government has done so far suggests that they are pro-Russia. The US has been heavily anti-Russia since this whole thing started, heavily backing Ukraine financially. So, if the question is whether the US has been funding Ukraine, then the answer is yes. The United States' involvement in the conflict has been aimed at supporting Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and promoting a peaceful resolution to the conflict. Since 2014, the US government has provided more than $3 billion in military aid to Ukraine, including weapons. This aid is intended to help Ukraine defend itself against Russian-backed separatists in the eastern part of the country. In 2014, the US provided Ukraine with $118 million in non-lethal aid, which included items like body armor, helmets, and night vision goggles. However, the aid was limited as the US did not want to get directly involved in the conflict. But then in 2015, as it became obvious that Russia was not going to back down, the US decided that they had to do more than offer non-lethal aid. They had to get more involved. That time around, the government increased its financial involvement in the conflict by providing lethal aid to Ukraine. The US provided Ukraine with anti-tank missiles, which were a critical component of the Ukrainian army's fight against Russian-backed separatists. This aid was provided under the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which was designed to help Ukraine defend itself against Russian aggression. The US has only continued to get more involved after that, expanding its involvement to more than just providing funds for military weapons. For instance, not too long ago, the US government extended an invitation to Ukrainian forces to train on an Air Force system in the US. And while military aid still forms the core of the financial aid that the United States has been offering, the country has also been providing financial assistance to Ukraine's economy and providing humanitarian relief as well. Altogether, America has directed over $70 billion in assistance to Ukraine since the whole conflict started, and the government seems poised to do even more if the war persists. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the US is not new to interfering in other countries' conflicts, offering military and humanitarian aid to the country that it believes to be in the right and in need of all the help it can get. However, what they have given to Ukraine so far is more than they have given to any other country at war, including Israel, a longtime top recipient of aid from the US. Now, of course, an argument can be made that whatever the US gives was theirs in the first place. So, they hold the right to do whatever they want with their funds. But it is really interesting to see how involved the US has decided to be in the Ukraine war, probably more involved than they have been in other conflicts, at least financially. Many are starting to wonder whether the US has some ulterior motives in pumping all of that money into the war, even though they are supporting the underdog. Even if the US doesn't necessarily have ulterior motives, critics of the US involvement argue that the aid provided to Ukraine has only escalated the conflict and prolonged the suffering of the Ukrainian people. They argue that the US should not be this ready and willing to pump large sums of money into a war, especially considering that most of that money goes into helping Ukraine to fight. Some people believe that the US should have taken a more diplomatic approach and worked towards a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Well, to be fair, the US has taken the diplomatic approach as well. In 2015, the United States, Russia, Ukraine, and several other European nations signed the Minsk Agreements, a series of ceasefires and peace agreements aimed at ending the Donbass war between Russian separatist groups and the Ukrainian armed forces. However, the full-blown war is evidence that the agreements were not fully implemented. Also, remember that the US started by providing non-military aid. Plus, the United States has imposed sanctions on Russia in response to its actions in Ukraine. These sanctions targeted individuals and entities involved with the annexation of Crimea and the conflict in eastern Ukraine, and aimed to put pressure on the Russian government to change their minds and decide to respect Ukraine's sovereignty instead. However, none of that worked. Vladimir Putin sees the sovereign state of Ukraine as Russia's birthright and has refused to cower under the weight of the US withdrawing its hand of friendship and imposing sanctions. It seems kind of obvious that Putin is not willing to stick to any agreement treaties unless those treaties would be signing Ukraine over to Russia. So, most likely, the US government sees helping Ukraine to fight as the only way forward. But it's not just the government. Most American citizens are happy that the US is helping Ukraine out. And this is somewhat surprising considering that the US is not in danger of being a spillover war ground like some of Ukraine and Russia's neighbors. Granted, some of these people might not have an idea of exactly how much help the US has been sending to Ukraine, but I doubt that that would make much of a difference. All of that said, it has to be mentioned that all the funds that the US has funneled into the Ukraine war haven't been dispersed yet. Most of the funds promised will be dispersed over a long period. Ukraine will not get some of that fund until 2025, and some won't get to Ukraine until 2030. And the reason disbursement has been stretched this far is that the funds are for military weapons, and many of those weapons haven't been built yet. Now that I've said it, I understand how it could sound to some people like the US wants this war to run for as long as possible. Why else will they send these funds that will not be used by Ukraine until 2030? Well, there is a good and less sinister explanation for this. First off, in this kind of situation, it is generally best to plan for the worst-case scenario. Most of us don't want the war to continue till the end of the year and talk more about 2030. However, it could and would do Ukraine good to be prepared for that possibility. Secondly, it looks like the US is not just interested in helping Ukraine to win the war, but also in helping them rebuild its military once the war is over. So, if the war came to an end today, Ukraine would continue to get a steady supply of military weapons. You can tell me whether or not you think that's a good idea in the comments section below. But to wrap up this video, America is pumping a lot of money into the Ukraine war, and the reason seems altruistic enough. However, we all know that altruistic moves could still have terrible consequences. I'll leave the interpretation of that to you. If you liked this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. Have a nice day and see you in the next video.